In the gathering of strangers, Brooks was happy to see a familiar face, that of his VC-65 squadron mate, Tom Van Brunt. In light of what they had seen that morning, neither man had much to say. As the senior lieutenant in the group, Van Brunt was tapped to lead the next strike. Everyone was in a hyped-up state well before the squadron steward served the coffee. Brooks took some deep breaths and said a few Hail Marys as he reflected on what he had been through. I had really done some deep thinking as we were coming back. It was settling in on me what was happening. What can I do? I thought. I came to a realization. I didn't want to make a suicide run. A pilot was always better off alive than dead. Still, Brooks wasn't sure what could be done about the long odds facing them on the next sortie. He had no idea what the status of the Japanese fleet was. He knew only that it was big. The aviator told his crewmen, Joe Downs and Ray Travers, "I don't expect we're going to see the sunset. So, if you don't care to join me on this mission, you've got my blessing. I don't think we're going to get out of this." The offer was a non-starter. The two air crewmen wouldn't hear of it. They were all in this together. As the plane handlers, armourers, aviation machinists and ordnance men on the Marcus Island gassed, armed and spotted the Avengers for launch, Tom Van Brunt diagrammed the plan of attack down in the ready room. In his whole aviation career, Van Brunt had dropped just 12 torpedoes in practice. Only 2 of them had run true that thought gripped him now. He was going out there for real, against real ships, firing real flak that would kill him for real if his number came up and he took a hit. However, slight his preparation, this was what he was there to do. He found a quiet place to pray for a moment and thought about his family, his older brother aboard the light cruiser Reno, his younger brother Bernard, whom he'd just seen at Seadler Harbour at Manus, amid the huge gathering of 7th Fleet ships, and his wife and first child, whose pictures adorned his desk. He prayed that somehow they would be cared for if he didn't return. That possibility loomed large in his mind. He knew that once he was locked into a torpedo run, evasive action was out of the question. Limitations on speed and altitude and maneuverability made the chances of returning not terribly good. The men on the ships of Taffy 3 were bound to their fate. Jumping overboard was pointless. There was nowhere to go in the water, so they just went along and did their jobs. Aviators always retained the option of escape, but the impulse to escape seized few, if any, of the escort carrier pilots in action that day. The thought never entered Van Brunt's mind. The Samuel B. Roberts was finished. Bob Copeland knew it when Lloyd Gurnett declared the ship a goner. No one would have wanted to hold on longer than the first lieutenant. "I would advise the captain to abandon ship," he called up to the bridge. Copeland then passed on the word "abandon ship, men, well done." Copeland next ordered the ship destruction bill carried out. Shell-shocked and half-conscious, but eager to comply with the order to destroy sensitive equipment and documents that might fall into enemy hands, Elbert Gentry beat the lenses out of a pair of ordinary 7x50 binoculars, then smashed the glass face of a gyro repeater display. Howard Cayo, a sound man, was in better condition to discern what was top secret from what was not. A trained acrobat, Cayo took a sledgehammer and gave the sonar machine a few well-aimed blows. Then he took a Tommy gun and peppered the contraption liberally with .45 caliber slugs, nearly hitting his skipper, Bob Roberts, and Gentry with the ricochets. Tom Stevenson and a signalman third class named Charles Natter ran below decks on the steadily settling ship. The communications officer was responsible for destroying the code books and other sensitive publications. Stevenson did his duty, though the urgency was largely lost on him under fire. "You're thinking about your family. You're thinking this is the end." There was nothing else to do. Stevenson ran to the small closet adjacent to the radio shack and bagged up the metal wheels from the decoding machine, which he would throw overboard. Then he went to destroy the coding machine itself, not finding the grenade that was supposed to be on hand for this sad contingency. Natter used a submachine gun to similar effect. That job done, Stevenson and Natter headed below to find the safe that contained secret documents and publications, including the Leyte Gulf invasion plans. With his way lit by battery-powered battle lanterns, Stevenson climbed through a hatch scuttle and found the safe. Though the ship was shaking from hits and the list seemed to increase, he remembered the combination, and the safe door swung open. He loaded what papers he could into several weighted cloth sacks. He and Natter hauled the sacks topside and tossed them overboard. Then Stevenson went down again, alone. He fetched some more bags and ascended to the main deck. Dick Rode had been only too happy to hear the abandoned ship order. Sitting at his desk, wearing an inflatable life belt instead of a bulky Kapok life vest, the radio man could feel the deck plating under his feet, growing frighteningly warm. Smoke stung his nostrils. When he tried to stand, he found that his headset was still jacked into his radio console. Rhoda came out on deck and found himself standing next to his chief radio man, Tullio Serafini. All of a sudden, there was another big blast. I felt something hit me on the leg, and I looked at Serafini, and there was just blood all over the place. It was awful. He couldn't see how Serafini was ever going to make it. Half his left shoulder had been blown away, and he was bleeding severely. Rode looked down at his own leg and saw a big hole in his dungarees. Underneath, the flesh looked like so much gristle hamburger. He had seen enough. No need to stare at that awful mess, he thought. Numb, he put it out of his mind and somehow climbed down the ladder from the radio shack to the main deck. Walking up to the rail, he removed his shoes and laid them neatly by the gunwale alongside another pair that belonged to another swimmer. Then Rhoda lifted his good leg over the line and jumped in. When he hit the water, he bobbed up and down a few times in the fuel oil and discovered that his life belt had been torn by shrapnel and did not hold him. Then, remembering his training to swim away from a sinking ship in order to avoid getting sucked under with it, he struck out in the direction in which he swam. However, a Japanese warship loomed. Rode was close enough to see crewmen staring at the stricken American ship. "I'm swimming the wrong way," he thought, realizing that no one else was around him. Floating nearby was the miniature life vest that Sam Blue had fashioned for Sammy, the ship's celebrated mascot. Rhoda tucked it under his arm for a little extra buoyancy, then swam back around the stern of the ship and joined a cluster of survivors. The dog, too, swam to momentary safety. Somehow Sammy got off the ship, and without the benefit of his custom-tailored canine flotation device, paddled out to a raft. He was there only a short time, however, when he decided that he belonged back on the Samuel B. Roberts, his home. The dog jumped off the raft and swam back toward the sinking ship. No one knew his fate for certain, but that was the last anyone saw of him. Sammy either drowned during the swim or went down with his ship. Though he had commanded Samuel B. Roberts barely half a year, Copeland was bonded strongly enough to his ship to view her as a living thing, a machine with its own soul and persona. Yet he understood too the reality that the source of any ship's life lay in the lives of those who crewed her. When Tom Stevenson returned with a second sackload of classified publications, Bob Copeland went in search of his wounded to make sure they got off the ship. First, the skipper ducked into his sea cabin and collected his letters and personal effects, whatever he could sweep together and carry. Then he went to the bridge, where he and Bob Roberts searched for and found the ship's muster list, watch quarter, station bill, and other administrative documents. One of the bags Tom Stevenson had thrown overboard must not have been weighted. There it was, bobbing along on the swells. Copeland told Stevenson he had better jump in and weigh it down, lest its sensitive contents fall into the wrong hands. Still wearing his microphoned talker's helmet, and realizing that this was his skipper's way of getting another man off the ship, Stevenson leaped off the amidships rail. When he hit the surface, the helmet became a drag brake, jerking his head upward while his body lurched downward. He was weighed down by a .45 caliber pistol, which he discarded. He threw away the helmet and a standard-issue bandolier of pistol ammunition around his waist, too. He kept his supply of morphine syrettes. He and Lloyd Gurnett found an expiring crewman from the engine room, and they each jabbed him with a needle full of the numbing potion. Copeland turned to his executive officer and said, "Now, Bob, I want you to go down to the main deck and hustle things a little bit, and then I want you to get into the water and be out there to supervise the men." "Captain," Roberts said, "I'm not leaving until you leave. I don't want you to be a damn fool and get heroic and go down with the ship." Copeland seemed to appreciate the honor that underlay this particular kind of insubordination. "Now look, Bob," he said, "I'm not intending to go down with the ship. I don't know what will happen. We are still under fire. My duty is to stay here until the men are off, and I'm going to do that, as soon as everybody is off. If I'm still alive, you can rest assured that I'm getting off. I haven't any false sense of glory like those old German naval sea captains who put on their best uniforms and stood up on the bridge and went down with the ship. but I am going to wait until I get my men off." The executive officer remained unmoved. "Bob," the captain said, "I don't want to get tough with you. You are my exec and my good friend. But remember, this is an order. I want a responsible senior officer to be with the survivors, and I'm ordering you to leave the ship. If that's the way you put it, Captain, I'll go. That's just the way I'm putting it. I trust I'll see you in the water. But in case I don't, Bob, it's been swell being with you." Copeland stuck out his hand. "You've been a swell exec, and I want you to know that it's been wonderful serving with you, Captain. I hope you make it. I'm leaving you with reluctance." The two officers took their .45s and the bandoliers of extra ammunition from their waists, and with a minor ceremonial flourish, 1, 2, 3, flung their weapons into the sea from the flying bridge. At that, Roberts left his skipper to go over the side. Copeland walked aft to the rear section of the bridge and surveyed what was left of his ship. It gave me an awfully hurt and crushed feeling to see the men lying there wounded and dead, and to see our ship, once as alive as the people on her, battered and lifeless. But even among the dead there were living. Amid a tangle of human rubble on the boat deck, Copeland saw movement. There, reclined against the ship's stack in a pool of blood, Chief Electrician's mate Charles Stowback was still alive. The captain hollered for Frank Cantrell, the chief quartermaster, and a couple of radarmen to go look after him. As the men went up to check on Stowback, Copeland thought to check in on the Combat Information Center to make sure the classified radar equipment had been destroyed. The ship's interior compartments were dark. Copeland found a battle lantern, but it did not light. The nearest flashlight was equally useless. He retrieved from his pocket a cigarette lighter, and it lit, and he looked around the Combat Information Center. He was satisfied to see that the machinery had been thoroughly smashed. He found himself compelled to visit his sea cabin again. He went there and looked at the photos of his family that lay beneath a large rectangular section of plexiglass on his desk. For 40 or 50 long seconds he stood there looking at the pictures of Harriet and the kids in the flickering light. Copeland went back to the main deck, where pharmacist's mates First Class Oscar King and George Schaffer were tending to a group of wounded. Charles Stowback was there, crying, though Copeland was pretty sure the 35-year-old electrician had no idea how badly he was hurt. It really made me sick at my stomach and sick at my heart when I saw him, because from his backbone, clear around on his left side, all was gone. From what Copeland could tell, Stowback was paralyzed. We ripped blue chambray shirts off 6 or 8 dead men, wadded them up, and stuck them into his lung cavity, and wrapped another shirt around him and tied him, but he didn't know the difference. Stowback didn't want to get in the water, sobbing. He asked Copeland, "Captain, do you think I'll live?" "Oh, sure, Stowback. Get off the ship, and we'll take care of you. I don't want to die, Captain. I've never seen my baby yet." Copeland knew that about 2 weeks before Stowback had learned of the birth of his baby boy. The skipper considered him a fine man and was heartbroken that he would not live to see his newborn son. Stowback tried awfully hard. They got him into the water around 9:30 a.m. Copeland proceeded alone to look for any remaining survivors on the ship. The passageway between the galley and wardroom section and the main deckhouse was obscured by steam rolling up from the No. 1 fire room. Holding his hand over his mouth and nose to avoid the heavy stench of the steam, Copeland ploughed through, making his way by memory. He reached the point where he knew a hatch to be, raised his right foot to step over it, and brought it down on top of some kind of obstruction. When he looked more closely, he found his foot planted firmly in the face of a dead radio man. His body didn't seem to have a scratch, nor did the body of the boy lying next to him, though Copeland figured these sailors had to have been blown a fair distance in order to die where they lay. I don't think there was a whole bone in them. They were just lying there as placid and peaceful as could be. Copeland became unhinged at the sight of those boys, and the larger picture of destruction all around. So long as there had been a fight to conduct, a captain could occupy himself with any number of details that obscured the essential horror of what was happening to his ship and his men. There was the steady patter of information from the Combat Information Center team, the orders from Admiral Sprague over the talk between ships, sightings from lookouts and reports from gunnery control, from damage parties, and from the engine rooms. He was freed of all that now, and despaired. The ship had been a very live thing, the ship herself and the men on her. Now she was a battered piece of junk, In a daze, he walked the length of the deck, stopping at the motor whaleboat dangling from its davits. Its wooden bottom had been shot clean out. He stood on the deck, looking straight through the whaleboat's busted hull, and shuddered. That one picture summed up the whole desolate destruction of a living ship with living men coming into an emptiness of nothing. He was alone on that side of the ship. He moved aft, so distraught that he lost his step. His foot slipped out ahead of him. He lurched out of balance, and he found himself sitting on the deck. He put down both of his hands, and when he picked them up, they were covered with blood. It was dripping from above, right on top of him. A headless body was hanging over the edge of a gun tub overhead. The puddle beneath it was large enough that the seat of his khakis and his loafers and socks were wet with blood. He got up and continued down the deck, not really caring what he found or what he did. As I walked down toward the fantail, I was nearly drowned because when I got back to where the 3 14-inch shells had ripped into us and taken the side out, the main deck was gone from there on, and I just barely caught myself from dropping right into the water. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland could not swim, finding no one in any condition to save, and doubting his ability to do it in any case, Copeland made his way back to the place where Lloyd Gurnett and the other officers had gathered. He and Gurnett used their last minutes on the ship looking for more survivors. They found a man sprawled halfway into the yeoman's office. He was still alive, though the nature of his wounds made it difficult to recognize him. When we touched him, the blood would ooze out like water from a sponge. We raised his eyelids, but he was blind in both eyes. He was unconscious. His eyeballs, his irises, and his pupils had been penetrated by fine shrapnel. After some time they figured out he was the chief machinist's mate, Charles Smith. How he ever got up there we'll never know, but he was still alive, though barely so. Copeland ordered King and Schaffer to put Smith into a life jacket and get him over the side. A Japanese destroyer stood nearby, lobbing the occasional shell into the Samuel B. Roberts's ruined mass. The ship took 4 more hits while the abandoned ship effort was underway. Water was lapping up over the port side of the destroyer escort's fantail when machinist's mate second class Chalmer Goheen went to check on Paul Henry Carr's gang back in Gun 52. The gun had been silent since the muffled thud of the breech explosion, where the water hadn't yet reached. The decks were covered with burning oil. Goheen crossed the deck, peered into the gun mount's ripped hatch, and found a horrific scene. Most of the men inside had been obliterated by the blast. They had gotten off 324 rounds of the 325 the ship carried in its after magazine, firing the last 7 or 8 shells without a working gas ejection line to clear the breach, until one of the final rounds got them. Looking into the mount, Goheen discovered where the magazine's last round was. It was right there before him, cradled in the arms of Paul Carr himself. The man was alive, though barely, torn from his neck to his groin. Carr was struggling to hold the shell. He begged Goheen to help him load it into the wrecked breech tray. Goheen took the shell from Carr's arms and laid the gunner's mate on the floor of his mount. Then he took Seaman First Class James Gregory, whose leg had been severed near the hip, and carried him out and set him on the deck. When Goheen returned to the mount, Carr was on his feet again, shell cradled weakly in his arms. Goheen took the shell from Carr again, lifted him, and carried him out to the deck. Paul Henry Carr of Chakotah, Oklahoma, proud member of the Future Farmers of America, football and baseball letterman, brother to 8 sisters, only son of Thomas and Minnie Mae Carr, died there on the deck of his battered, broken warship. The Roberts was going down by the stern. Riding the swells, wearing a kapok life jacket and an inflated rubber belt, Bob Copeland, the skipper who couldn't swim, turned to Lloyd Gurnett and asked, "How do you go about getting out of here?" Gurnett responded, "Well, the best way, Captain, is to roll over on your back and swim on your back. Just work your arms this way and kick your legs. You'll get going." The commanding officer of the Samuel B. Roberts got the rhythm of it and inched his way toward a life raft they had spotted a few hundred yards away. Where George Bray was standing on the fantail, the water was already lapping above his knees. Chalmer Goheen had asked him to help get some of the wounded overboard. Goheen brought Seaman First Class Willard Thurmond to Bray. Bray could tell he was a goner. He helped Thurmond to the rail, and the mortally injured man just held on there, oblivious to his wounds. Bray helped someone else off the ship, then made his way toward the fantail. He just sat down and started swimming. When they entered the water, the survivors of the Roberts baptized themselves in their ship's own blood. The surface of the ocean was covered with a 3-inch layer of oil. All around the ruined ship bobbed black faces set with glaring white eyes and teeth. The substance was more a slippery kind of foam than a proper form of oil. The sea's gentle swells animated it like a slowly undulating blacktop. Copeland had been among the last to leave. The honour of being the very last man off belonged to George Schaffer, jumping ship and joining a large group of men who had clambered over the portside rail. Forward, where the deck sloped upward ever more steeply as the ship settled by the stern, there was a considerable jump to make. Off the port side, Copeland joined a small group of men on a floater net, a large web of nylon mesh woven throughout with a bunch of black rubber discs that gave it its buoyancy. Spotting a raft some distance away, some survivors formed a human chain. The raft, designed for 25 men, soon wallowed under the weight of 50. Survivors were attracted to the group as small bits of interstellar flotsam to a star's gravitational field. They moved the raft on top of the net to increase its buoyancy, gathering by the life raft that kept the group together. Dick Rode heard someone wondering whether the depth charges had been set on safe. It was Vince Goodrich's job, and God knew there had been precious little time to stick to procedure in the midst of the hellish fusillades that tore the seas around them. The question, however, was of more than procedural significance. A depth charge that burst underwater produced a wave of blast pressure that could blow a man apart from the inside out. Sailors were trained to cover their buttocks or lift them out of the water to avoid the potentially fatal enema that an underwater explosion could give them. Once more Rode was on the move, paddling and kicking to get away from the ship. Wearing khaki pants and a t-shirt, drifting with a group of survivors scattered across the water on the other side of the ship, Tom Stevenson watched Japanese vessels shooting at his sinking ship from all sides. Occasionally an errant shell would land nearby and kick up a splash, sometimes disconcertingly close. He prayed for the Roberts to sink quickly, if only to deprive the Japanese of the pleasure and the practice. Seaman First Class Bud Comet floated off the port quarter of the ship, right below gun 52, where a gigantic shell from the Congo had struck, gutting that side of the ship and opening its mechanical entrails to the sea. The huge cave mouth opened into an even larger void inside, a grey steel cavern whose unseen corners reached deep into the ship. From its size, Comet figured the hole was the product of a Japanese shell that had detonated on contact. Nearby he saw evidence of another shell hit, much more benign, a neatly drilled hole that an armour-piercing round had made as it passed through the ship without exploding. The contrast was remarkable. Here was the difference between life and death, determined solely by the choice of ordnance on the part of a Japanese handling room crewman below decks on a ship many miles away. Backlit by flames licking at a far bulkhead, two objects inside that cavern commanded Comet's attention, a life raft and the huddled form of a man inside of it. Comet swam closer and recognized the Roberts' chief boatswain's mate, Cullen Wallace. He was still conscious, kneeling inside the raft. Probably he had come down a ladder and found the raft and settled into it, hoping somehow that he could paddle his way out of the ship. But he was stuck there, evidently trapped by the inrush of seawater, arms braced on the sides of the raft. Watching Comet swim his way, the chief hollered at him a few times to come help him. The oil-soaked sailor swam back to the ship, gingerly moving past the jagged threshold of the torn hull, and grabbed the raft. Then he pulled it clear of some wreckage into the pool of water that had filled that part of the Roberts, and that rose slowly and serenely as the ship began to sink by the stern. Comet got the impression that the chief, like his captain, could not swim. He eased the raft across the splintered opening in the hull and watched as Edward Wheaton, a radio technician, swam up and climbed in. Comet paddled the raft around to the stern of the ship. The depth charge racks lying over the fantail were submerged already. The name Samuel B. Roberts, stenciled on the transom, was under water too. Blown apart like an apple on a tree stump were the remnants of the steel shell of gun 52, Paul Carr's mount, turned defiantly out to port, its barrel still aglow. There was a tangle of metal piled into it from the side, the remains of the deckhouse beneath Johnny Leclerc's disintegrated 40mm mount. From the stern, Comet heard a shout. It was from an officer hollering for help. When Comet saw him and started paddling the raft in his direction, Wallace told him to leave him be, let him swim. The chief didn't want the burden of bringing anybody else aboard the raft, but if Bud Comet remembered anything that his father had told him at the West Virginia train station 6 months earlier, he showed it by his actions now. Don't dishonor your mother. This country is worth dying for. A coward dies 1,000 times. Defying his chief's command, he paddled toward the fantail and picked up Ensign Jack Moore. Once the crew had decided to abandon the Roberts, it was unbearable to watch the enemy continue to have its way with her. For all they had done, some could not escape thinking, if only we had stayed on and fought a little longer, we might have prevented this final indignity. We were the proudest ship in the fleet, we really were, Tom Stevenson said. We thought we were the cat's meow. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the Samuel B. Roberts rolled over on her beam ends and sank by the stern. No explosion followed the ship's disappearance beneath the waves. The only reaction was a swell of sadness among the crewmen who watched her go. Floating a quarter-mile away, Dick Rode watched the Roberts sink. It took about an hour, but it seemed to take forever. She went down gracefully, seeming not to make a sound. Before she had fully committed herself to the deep, the Roberts stood nearly vertical. Stenciled with the number 413 on each side, the bow held high in the air for a moment, standing like an oblique headstone. Then the ship slowly retracted into the sea. "Boys, take off your hats. There goes a good ship," said Boatswain's Mate First Class Red Harrington. The sight of it moved Lloyd Gurnett to open sobbing. As First Lieutenant he knew every welded seam in her, Copeland wrote. He knew where every fitting was attached. Love of the ship was very deep in his heart. Once the ship was gone, the culture of cynical jocularity that had characterized the wardroom seemed to disappear. Among the men on Copeland's raft, it seemed as if the bottom had dropped out of things, now that she was gone. Everyone felt low. The white caps kicked up a bit now. Then Staubach, the grievously wounded chief electrician's mate, lost his mind, raving and yelling deliriously. Scanning the oil-slicked waters for other survivors to join, Dick Rode found his way to the raft with Jack Moore, Cullen Wallace, Jack Hewson, Bud Comet, and others. The men had fastened together their life raft and floater net into a self-contained survival pod that kept everybody together. Wallace didn't want to do it. He said he was concerned about air attack and did not want to concentrate the men in one big vulnerable group. He also felt that such a large group would consume the raft's limited provisions too quickly. As the officer in charge of this group, Moore overrode him, feeling that the priority should be rescue rather than avoidance of air attack. The wooden latticed bottom of the raft had been shot up pretty well. A pharmacist's mate approached Rode, who was sitting inside the raft, and tried to pour sulphur powder into his gaping leg wound. The radio man wondered what the point was. When he got back into the water, it would just wash the powder away. Not considering himself too badly hurt, Rode vaulted himself overboard. Later, looking up at a dozen or so men perched comfortably on the side of the raft, including Lieutenant West and Ensign Moore, though both officers seemed uninjured, he decided to hoist himself up and take a break from treading water. But when he tried to climb up, one of the men wound up and slugged him hard in the head, knocking him back down. Rode was stunned at his first taste of the Darwinian imperative. With nerves running hot on a makeshift floating wagon train loaded with twice as many men as it was built to carry, Jack Moore decided there was going to have to be rationing with disciplinary backing. Everyone was already at each other's throat. The Hole had sunk first. The Gambier Bay went down at 9:07 a.m. The Roberts followed an hour later. Now came the Johnstons' turn. The first ship into the fight was the last to go down. Her luck had been the improbable stuff of dime novels or Hollywood fantasies. The solo charge in the battle's opening minutes, firing guns and torpedoes into the teeth of multiple enemy broadsides, wheeling under fire to escape, taking devastating hits from battleship shells. Then withdrawing, returning to action against the destroyer column, and fending off the last Japanese effort to sink Clifton Sprague's carriers. Her final destruction was not ensured until after the foe she had suicidally charged had turned and run for cover. Bob Deal knew the ship was a goner. Water columns were substantially higher, and shells overhead had a distinctly different resonance. Came then an impact so severe I thought we might have struck a marine obstruction. The ship shuddered, rolled hard port and starboard, Resuming course at a reduced speed, going forward on the starboard side, I learned we had taken a hit in the engine room. Electrician's mate First Class Alan Johnson understood the fragile extent to which the Johnston held on to life. His battle station was the emergency generator room, tucked away on the starboard side of the ship between the forward fire room and the galley. Before enlisting in 1942, the 25-year-old petty officer had worked for 4.5 years at the Birmingham Electric Company, running substations that brought steam and power into Dixie's industrial centre. The Johnston derived its vital electrical power from generators located in the engine rooms. The generators, like the engines, were run by steam from the boiler room attached to them. With one boiler room already out, and Lieutenant Jesse Cochrane and his men struggling in vain to gain power from the other, the only source of power on the Johnston was the emergency generator, powered not with steam but by a diesel motor. If the engine room generators were knocked out, a pilot light went off, a relay opened, and the emergency generator kicked on automatically. When the Johnston was first hit, Johnson had the terrible sensation of being lifted from the ground and shaken violently. The hit to the after-engine room knocked its electrical switchboard dead. Instantly, the emergency generator in the electrician's mate's cramped compartment filled the void, its 3-cylinder diesel motor coughing to life. But the motor bled too. The shock of the multiple blasts below decks broke the lubrication pipe that ran to the motor. Oil ran down into the corner of Johnson's compartment. With motor machinist's mate Second Class Roger Goujon, he scooped the oil from the floor by hand and slathered it back into the diesel motor. Johnson ran to the Combat Information Centre and grabbed a roll of 3/4-inch friction tape. It didn't stick well to the oily metal, but he used enough of it to slow, if not stop, the diesel motor's bleeding. His emergency station would turn out some electricity, but only for so long. The oil leaked everywhere. They were able to return only a portion of it to the engine. From such mundane mechanical causes do gallant ships die. Without power, Bob Hollenbaugh would fire his state-of-the-art 5-inch gun like a 19th-century artilleryman. The men in the ammunition handling room would do the work of their electro-hydraulic hoists, passing shells by hand. Light would come from battle lanterns, if at all, and volunteers would turn the big wheel on the rudder's steering pumps, struggling to keep up with Captain Evans's course changes, shouted down from above. They would do all these things, taking the place of their equipment, or they would die along with everyone else the next time a salvo found its mark. The endless salvos of incoming shells passing overhead, astern, off the bow, all around the ship. Now Alan Johnson felt one land close by. When the large shell struck near his emergency generator compartment, it felt like a freight train's coal box was dropped on top of me. The bulkhead between his compartment and the galley was blown down flat. The only source of light he had was a small, sparking electrical fire that filled the compartment with flickering shadows. With a 3/4-inch brass bolt head having ripped through his back between the shoulder blade and spine, Johnson pulled himself to his feet and called out to Goujon. Johnson couldn't see him, and there came no answer to his call. Groping through the compartment, he felt Goujon's head and shoulders, but his torso was pinned under something, a large mass of hot metal. It was the diesel engine. It was too heavy to move, and having run steadily for well over an hour, it was too hot even to touch. With the bolt head throbbing in his right chest cavity, Johnson was becoming numb with shock. He was sure, however, of at least two things. His friend was dead, and the time had finally come to get the hell off his dying ship. At 9:40 a.m., when an avalanche of shells struck the ship, inflicting her final meaningful damage, the Johnston's 2.5-hour sprint through hell ended. The shell that sealed the destroyer's fate struck the number 1 boiler room, cutting steam to the forward turbine and stopping the starboard screw. The ship, powerless, began coasting to its final resting place. As the Pacific currents took over the work of the Johnston's engines, Captain Evans passed the order to abandon ship. She was a vehicle now suitable only for the dead. On the destroyer's main deck, on the port side amidships, lay what Jesse Cochrane described as a pile of people, bodies, half alive, half dead. Many survivors saw it, but none seemed to fathom quite how this stack of human cordwood could have formed. In part, it was the inscrutable arrangement chosen by the shock waves from heavy shells that had propelled men and parts of men out of interior compartments and into their final poses. Some sailors had been carried out and laid there by their buddies in the hope that, out in the open, they might get medical attention. Others had struggled out under their own power and lain down, exhausted beyond exhaustion, desperate for cooler air to breathe. Ellsworth Welch went forward repeating the abandoned ship order. Under the abandoned ship plan, rehearsed many times but without much belief in its utility, Welch was supposed to report to a life raft stored on the ship's port side by the wardroom. By the time Welch got there, sailors had already released the raft and jumped into the water. Welch found coxswain Ed Block struggling in vain to put on a life jacket. The morphine Welch had given him when the bridge was first hit had made him sluggish, so the officer helped him slide into the life jacket and eased him into the water. Welch then tried to help another sailor, but the severity of his wounds made the effort moot. Dusty Rhodes and Warren Williams climbed up on the deck house by Bob Hollenbohr's gun 54 and tossed a nylon mesh floater net into the water. When I jumped over, Rhodes recalled, I had two thoughts enter my mind. Both silly. One, how deep is this water? I wonder if I'll hit bottom. Number two, how far is it to land? Robert Billy dragged himself to the edge of the gunwale, crawling and rolling with his good left arm, then dropped down to the main deck amid bodies, body parts, and blood. On their way down from the gun director, Bob Hagan and several fire controlmen passed Billy without a second look. Billy couldn't speak. He could scarcely move. He didn't blame them for consigning him to the dead. With only one good arm, he finally hauled himself to the rail. Though he wasn't able to lift himself over and into the water, the enemy obliged him. A salvo of shells struck the ship near where he lay, and the impact, the third blast he absorbed that day, propelled him overboard. He had 20 shrapnel wounds and 3 useless limbs. He didn't particularly like his chances in the water. Captain Evans left the fantail and walked forward to the wardroom, where Lieutenant Robert Brown was busy doing what he could for the living. Evans tried to persuade the doctor to abandon ship, but Brown wouldn't hear of it. There were wounded who needed to be tended to before they were given over to Neptune's mercy in the water. The doctor could do that work better aboard ship. He would use what time he had left. Bob Hagan, consumed with coordinating the ship's gunfire from the director mount, was slow to get the news that Evans had passed word to abandon ship. I peered out and couldn't see a living soul on the forecastle. "What the hell are we doing here?" I said. "Let's abandon ship." The last word hardly was out of my mouth when the 5 crewmen in the gun director with me dashed out and ran for the rail. I was so surprised that I stood stock still a moment, then lit out myself. I made my way to the forecastle. I couldn't get aft without walking over piles of bodies, and like a man in a dream, very carefully and leisurely took off my shoes and dived in. In the water, Hagan looked back at the ship and spotted his friend, Doc Brown, carrying wounded from the wardroom to the deck. Brown had just left the rail and headed back inside when there was a whistling rush of wind and an explosion right where Brown had entered. Hagan broke down and cried. The enormity of the moment was lost on many of the men who had survived to this point by attending to the myriad rote details of their assigned duties. The ship was gone, and their duties with it, but men still found trivialities to occupy their minds. Leaving the ship from the port side amidships, Bill Mercer swam about 100 yards off the port quarter with another sailor. I recall Marquard took his comb from his pocket, neatly combed his hair, and then threw his comb away, saying, "I don't guess I'll ever need that again." With the same habitual fastidiousness that others had exhibited, Ellsworth Welch took off his shoes and set them neatly together on deck before diving into the sea. One of the first survivors Bob Hagan encountered in the water was torpedoman First Class Jim O'Gorick. Cast afloat in 4,000 fathoms of shark-infested waters, defeated in battle with friends lost forever, O'Gorick swam over to Hagan and said cheerfully, "Mr. Hagan, we got off all 10 of them torpedoes, and they ran hot, straight and normal. Those torpedoes had made a real difference, knocking the Kumano out of the fight early in the battle, before it could close to effective gun range of the carriers." Ellsworth Welch looked up and saw a Japanese cruiser firing shells into the destroyer's ruined hulk. I would watch for belches of fire from the cruiser's guns and time the salvos so I could duck under the water before the shells hit. But wearing the lifebelt, I was only able to get the upper part of my body below the water. I must have looked like a duck feeding on food below. Others saw the column of destroyers approach again. The ships that the Johnston had forced into premature torpedo launches were circling her like raiders hunting settlers on the prairie. They fired directly into her wrecked hull, no longer deterred by the spirited work of Bob Hollenbaugh or Lieutenant Hagen or anybody else in the gunnery department. This was the Johnston's final service to Sprague's fleeing carriers, providing a static target for frustrated Japanese gunners who doubtlessly longed to sink something, anything, with an American flag on it. Though they had straddled the carriers repeatedly, Japanese gunners had claimed only the Gambier Bay. The 5 others seemed to possess luck worthy of ancient Japan's 7 lucky gods themselves, the legendary Shichifukujin. The Kalinin Bay had taken 15 hits from heavy cruiser main battery rounds and steamed on in defiance, but the Johnston's defiance was at an end. She would not get away. The decisions of her captain had ensured that she wouldn't. It was not a pointless death wish. The Johnston, like the Hole and the Samuel B. Roberts before her, had fulfilled her mission so thoroughly, had parried and riposted so well, that there was nothing left for the ship to do but pay the final price. What fate befell the Johnston's legendary captain is the subject of continuing conjecture among the ship's survivors. Bob Socher was among the last to see him. The motor machinist's mate, having gone aft to take his turn cranking the rudder pump, returned forward to fight a fire. As he walked toward the bow, there was a terrible, blinding yellow flash from a shell that struck the port side near the cook's galley. Knocked unconscious, Socher regained his senses to find himself covered in blood from his own wounds and his dead shipmates surrounding him. Realizing that the abandoned ship order had been passed, Socher headed for the fantail, where the jump into the water was easier. Everyone who was able to abandon ship had done so, he wrote. They were in rafts and nets and swimming approximately a quarter of a mile away. I went aft as Captain Evans went forward. With neither one saying a word to the other, we passed by, staring blankly at one another. Some claimed to have seen the Johnston's skipper climbing into the motor whaleboat that he had ordered released. Others were less confident he ever made it into the boat. Obeying the order to release the small craft, Alan Johnson found that its pulley mechanism didn't work. The electrician's mate reached for a knife he kept in his pocket, meaning to cut the lines that kept the boat suspended from its davits, but his pants pocket had been torn away. An officer produced a blade from his boot and cut the lines. When the gig hit the water, Johnson thought it was in good condition. He saw someone wearing a khaki uniform, an officer or a chief, jump into the water, climb in, start the engine and haul a wounded sailor aboard. Around that time, according to Johnson, Captain Evans began walking toward the fantail. As if beckoning him to safety, the gig drifted with him down the length of the ship. But by the time Johnson abandoned ship, diving into the water under heavy fire, he, like the rest of the crew on record, had not seen whether the skipper got into the whaleboat. If he did, in all likelihood he didn't go far. The craft's bottom, badly holed in the Japanese bombardment, was not close to being seaworthy. It has been written that so much of life is preparation, so much is routine, and so much is retrospect that the purest essence of anyone's genius contracts itself to a precious few hours. The window opened by circumstance on the genius of Commander Ernest E. Evans for 2.5 hours on the morning of October 25, 1944, so brilliantly lit from within, was once again closed. The chief of Annapolis, the Cherokee warrior unhorsed by enemy gunfire, was lost to the whirlwind, taken to a private oblivion that to this day burnishes his mystique and deepens the legend of his late great destroyer and its magnificent crew. On orders from Admiral Kinkaid, Jesse Oldendorf's old battleships had been standing by in Leyte Gulf, awaiting their next move in a desperate but uncertain naval chess game. Mindful of his duty to guard MacArthur's troops ashore, Kinkaid had been keeping a wary eye on Admiral Shimmer all morning, as the remnants of the southern force withdrew. Admiral Sprague's plea for help was compelling. Still, Kinkaid could not be sure that Shimmer would not reverse course and try again to break through into Leyte Gulf. From Kinkaid's flagship, the Wasatch, Sprague nevertheless received a voice message assuring him that help was on the way. Though the 7th Fleet battleships' magazines had spent much of their high-explosive ammunition during the shore bombardment, and a significant quantity of their armor-piercing rounds in the destruction of Nishimura's force, their armor-piercing ammunition stocks were more than sufficient to deal with another Japanese fleet. The most serious deficiency of the 7th Fleet Bombardment and Fire Support Group was its destroyers, which had spent their torpedoes at Surigao Strait and would not be reloaded until they could tie up to a tender again. Despite Taffy 3's perilous straits, Kincaid saw no alternative but to wait and see. Shortly before 10 a.m. the waiting ended. Satisfied that the Southern force wanted no further part of him, and fortified by the arrival of 2 fresh squadrons of destroyers, Kincaid finally ordered Oldendorf to take half his force and rally to the aid of Ziggy Sprague's beleaguered Northern Taffy Group. If Kurita continued charging southward, the American battle line would greet him memorably, but Kurita was already in full flight north. No sooner had Oldendorf relayed word to his commanders to prepare for a northward sprint than Kincaid countermanded the order upon learning that Kurita's fleet was in retreat. Aboard the Johnston all was quiet except for the flames, high above the wreckage of her silent decks, still flying. Harold Beresonsky thought the ship flying Old Glory looked proud and defiant. In the water, Bill Mercer and J.B. Strickland found themselves sandwiched between their beaten ship and a Japanese destroyer standing off the Johnston's port quarter firing into the ship's hull. I told Strick that I was sticking close to him because he owed me $100. Strick said, "If we make it, you'll sure get your 100. I was only joking because neither of us thought we would make it. Strickland had survived the Battle of Savo Island, a disastrous American defeat under the guns of a Japanese flotilla led by none other than the Chokai, late of the same day. Mercer asked Strickland how their present predicament compared to Savo Island. Strick said, "Kid, I have never seen anything like this. At about 10:10 a.m. the Johnston went down." "We all watched as our home for the past year slowly slid below the surface," Mercer wrote. Orin Vadnais swam away from the ship, then turned around to see destroyers and cruisers running in their half-circle around the Johnston, blazing away with all guns. As I watched, she started to sink. The first one end went down, and she slipped below the sea. As the ship rolled over and went down by the bow, Neil Deathlefs wondered whether he would be home in time for Christmas. Drifting along, he came upon 2 seamen. One was his friend, Soundman First Class Wally Weygand. The other sailor was holding Weygand's head above water. Deathlefs could see that Weygand had been scalded badly. The skin was hanging from his arms and hands like a pair of long gloves. Weygand asked Deathlefs if he was burned too. Deathlefs said no. Weygand said, "Boy, I sure am," checking his wounds. Bob Sochor found that much of the blood staining his skin probably belonged to other men. During his swim out to the life rafts, Sochor had met up with a young pharmacist's mate, Ken Bowers. He was very young and religious, and always carried a small Bible. He had on a life jacket, Sochor said, so I hung on to him to rest for a few minutes. We were now about halfway between the sinking ship and the rafts and nets. He said he could not swim, and he thought his life jacket would not hold the 2 of us. I told him I just wanted to rest a minute or so, and then I would leave. We were about 1/8 of a mile from the sinking ship when I turned to him and said, "Take your last look at the Johnston," as it disappeared into the sea. Ellsworth Welch watched the destroyer turn over slowly and settle by the bow until only the fantail was above water. Seeing my home go down, I felt my eyes welling with tears, but I thought, "Welch, you might need the liquid." So I ceased this unseamanlike display of emotion. Bobby Chastain felt similarly. I still remember that helpless feeling one gets while watching your home burn down. Bowers and another pharmacist's mate, Leighton Schmuff, ministered to the wounded, injected morphine, tied tourniquets. As the survivors of the Johnston gathered themselves into groups, a rare sight seized their attention, the direct approach of an enemy warship. For more than 3 hours, the ships had maneuvered under each other's fire, shooting by haphazard sight through smoke and squalls, or by the blind omniscience of radar. The range between the foes had never been short enough to see the individuals who operated them. Point-blank range in a modern naval battle was anything less than 3 miles. Now the enemy approached so closely that men could finally look upon other men. Clint Carter saw the ship coming before most of his shipmates did. It was bearing down on them fast. Judging by the size of the bow wake the destroyer was throwing, it was at flank speed. Then, when the ship, was just half a mile or so away. It slowed, its bow fell, its wake dissipated, and it approached them slowly, warily, ominously. The Americans weren't sure what to expect. Joseph Check, fearing the enemy gunners, would spray them with bullets where they swam, took a hard breath, and ducked under the surface. Clint Carter thought that for the Japanese, killing the Americans with bullets would be too labor-intensive when another tool stood at their disposal. His first thought was, they're going to give us a giant enema. A single depth charge laid into their midst would have produced a shallow underwater explosion strong enough to blow their bowels out. Watching the crew play their automatic weapons over the waters, others braced for machine gun fire. Neil Deathlefs started to untie Wally Wagon's kapok so he could drag him under water when the murderous rain finally fell. The destroyer edged closer and closer. It made a slight course change that left Clint Carter drifting off her starboard beam. He was taken with the ship's gold-tasseled battle pennant, emblazoned with a red rising sun. Bobby Chastain, swimming no more than 50 feet from the ship's port side, could see the sailors lined up by the rail, dressed sharply in khakis and brightly polished brown boots. They were watching us as we watched them. It was then that Carter realized what was going on. It appeared to me that every man on her deck was standing at attention, like a muster, giving us one big salute. As the Japanese warship slid by them, a smartly dressed officer was on the wing of the bridge, standing erect and indeed saluting. As she eased by us, Carter wrote, "I'm sure of one thing. She appreciated a fighting lady USS Johnston. Another Japanese crew was filming them with a handheld movie camera. Another flipped his thumb to his nose and delivered a sailor standing on the fantail tossed an object in Carter's direction. The canister was too big to be a grenade and far too small to be a depth charge. It was a large can of tomatoes. Carter retrieved the offering, examined it, and noticed the label indicating it had been packed in Arkansas. 3 years of war and they were still eating United States of America canned tomatoes. The Japanese destroyer disappeared, and the Johnston did too. A few minutes later, the underwater hulk of the Johnston did to her crew what they feared its Japanese counterpart would do. There were 2 great explosions in the deep. Speculation flew that the ship's boilers had blown. Others doubted the shattered machinery retained enough pressure to explode, and assigned blame to unsecured depth charges. Whatever the cause, the effect was breathtaking. The first sensation the men felt was a concussion to their stomach and abdomen, and a sickening thrust of pressure into their rectums. "I thought my body had been blown in half," wrote Charles Landreth. "What a wonderful feeling it was when I found out my body was still intact." Withdrawing northward with his harried task group, Takeo Kurita was enjoying considerably less peace of mind. He toyed with the idea of turning around again and attempting to re-enter Leyte Gulf. But late in the morning he received a radio dispatch sent at 10:18 a.m. by the skipper of one of the Southern Force destroyers, the Lucky Shigure. All ships except Shigure went down under gunfire and torpedo attack. So Nishimura was dead. Kurita could see no purpose in turning around and trying again to reach Leyte Gulf. The Show One plan had become a jaw with one mandible. For 2.5 hours, Takeo Kurita had been the hunter. Now, in flight northward, he became the hunted. Tom Van Brunt and 4 Avengers from the Marcus Island climbed above the clouds to 8,000 feet, joined with another group of Wildcats and Avengers, and turned north in pursuit of Kurita's withdrawing fleet. It was the 3rd major strike that the Taffy 2 carrier group would marshal against the center force that morning. They needed less than 30 minutes to find the withdrawing Japanese force. Against flak that reminded Van Brunt of the light show one gets on an express subway train roaring through a local station, the St. Lo aviator flew to within 1,200 feet of his target, a Congo-class battleship, jerked the release lever, and felt his plane heave from the change in gravity as the torpedo plunged into the water. As he flew over the Japanese ship, he felt the aircraft lurch again as a shell exploded near the rear of the fuselage. At once his left rudder cable was limp. There was nothing there. He could not turn left. The exact extent of the damage he could not yet know. His radio man, Les Fredrickson, was shaken up by a nearby shell explosion that was dampened only by the torpedo bomber, General Motors's thin skin. Van Brunt hugged the sea for a mile or two, testing his controls, and found that he could navigate well enough using just right rudder. As he looped back and gained altitude for the return flight, he looked back at his target and saw a wide trail of oil issuing from astern. Van Brunt guided his riddled aircraft toward home, the friendly flight deck of the St. Lo. By some impossible concatenation of independent miracles, the carrier had not taken a single hit during the battle, even though she rode the northern fringe of the circular formation of escort carriers closest to Kurita's ships. Only 3 of her crew were injured with superficial wounds from shrapnel. Meanwhile, the gunners on her tail-mounted 5-inch gun had acquitted themselves well. The battle off Samar was nearly over for the St. Lo, as shortly it would be for Tom Van Brunt. The naval aviator hailed the St. Lo's landing signal officer and informed him that his left rudder was out. Normally, landing approaches were made in a descending counterclockwise circle, a flight path that allowed planes to avoid the dangerous eddy of air trailing from the carrier's superstructure. Without a left rudder, Van Brunt could not make the usual approach. He radioed the landing signal officer that he would come in on a clockwise circle. The landing signal officer said, "Okay, we'll try that, but let's get everyone else aboard first." Climbing to 1,500 feet, he was circling the carrier at a distance, watching other planes land, when a red streak flew past his greenhouse canopy. The startling appearance of a Japanese meatball insignia painted on a wide white wing was Van Brunt's first indication that enemy aircraft were near. He almost collided with the Japanese plane as it descended toward the St. Lo. Shortly before 11 a.m., Taffy 3 came under wholesale kamikaze attack. The Japanese Army Air Corps had debuted this horrific new mode of warfare earlier that morning, when 6 Imperial planes took off from bases on Davao and attacked Thomas Sprague's Taffy 1 task unit. One struck the escort carrier Santee, starting a huge blaze that raged in the hangar deck for about 10 minutes. Only the expert marksmanship of gunners aboard the Suwannee, the Sangamon and the Petroff Bay let them avoid similar hits. At 10:50 a.m., 5 more aircraft flying from airdromes on Luzon arrived over Taffy 3 and plummeted like osprey on ships whose day of fighting should rightly have been over. The Kitkun Bay was the first of Sprague's jeeps to confront the horrifying new tactic. A Zero fighter plane closed from the port side, crossed her bow, climbed and dove at the bridge. Firing his machine guns as he came, the pilot guided his plane over the small island superstructure, glanced off a catwalk and hit the sea. 2 more kamikazes attacked the Fanshawe Bay. One approaching from astern was knocked off its killing path by a 5-inch shell fired by the flagship's pea-shooter crew. Though that explosion tore off the plane's left wing and the aircraft struck the water, where it disintegrated on impact, the bomb slung under its wing exploded 15 feet from the hull, showering the ship with shrapnel. Van Brunt saw the carrier's gunners shoot the second plane out of the sky. Few men aboard the St. Lo ever saw the plane that hit their ship. After 3 hours at general quarters, half the crew was still enjoying a breather. Captain Francis J. McKenna had ordered Condition 1 easy, allowing them to secure from general quarters and get a long-awaited cup of coffee. In the Combat Information Center, the Air Search Radar's plan position indicator scope was showing approaching aircraft. Though the planes did not transmit an identification friend or foe beacon, everyone assumed they were friendly. Radio technician Holly Crawforth had other things on his mind, like how he was going to repair the St. Lo's big whip antennas, shredded by the ship's own defensive bursts, when the general quarters alarm sounded. Crawforth was startled to hear the 20mm guns chattering. The crew had learned to dread the sound. Whenever the 20s were shooting, it meant the enemy was close. There, they could see it. A plane was approaching from the astern, a half-mile downrange. The pilot was coming in straight and level, as if lining up to land. The quartermaster told Captain McKenna, "Sir, that's a Japanese." No sooner had McKenna thrown the ship into a sharp, evasive turn to starboard than the Zero fighter, a bomb under each wing, rose up, nosed over, and plunged into the flight deck. In a burst of flames and smoke, the engine tore loose, bounced the length of the flight deck, and skidded off the bow. One or both bombs went off. The mangled fuselage penetrated the 4-inch wooden flight deck and exploded below decks. Captain McKenna's first impression was that the St. Lo had suffered no serious damage. A few minutes passed, then the bulkheads began to collapse. Ordnance man John Gettus was muscling a torpedo bomber, General Motors off the portside elevator, and into the cavernous hangar deck when he heard a terrific crash. A ball of fire smashed down through the flight deck, fell through 30 feet of space between the underside of the flight deck and the steel decking of the hangar, and landed amid 8 planes that Chief Petty Officer Earl Roberts and his ordnance gang were arming for action. Piled around the space where their aircraft were being worked on was enough weaponry to blow a small town out of existence. 8 torpedoes, 6 depth charges, 15 500-pound bombs, 40 100-pounders, and some 1,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Almost at once, this orderly, carefully orchestrated world of ordnance turned into a hellish, flaming maelstrom. "Oh my God," Gettus thought as the ammo went up. The first explosion shattered several planes, spilling burning aviation fuel onto the deck. It flowed into a large pool that covered a quarter of the cavernous hangar with flames 2 feet high. The plane that Gettus was pushing jumped forward 6 feet from the pressure wave of the blast. Another aircraft blew up, mowing down a firefighting team and knocking the bodies of the dead and the living across the deck. Gettus scrambled up a ladder and found that the flight deck had buckled horribly, black smoke pouring upward into the sky. A chief petty officer lurched by him in a daze. Everything but his shorts had been blown off. One arm hung by strips of skin. Below, at the Inferno's ground zero, men shambled about, wreathed in flames. Firefighters tried to gather, dragging big hoses, only to be scattered to the sponsons and catwalks by the pops and zings of baking machine gun rounds. In the short half-hour between the enemy plane's insane plunge through the flight deck and the ship's final surrender, the crew marked time by a sequence of grievous secondary explosions that shook the ship. The third and fourth explosions blew a hangar door from its hinges, launched a 100-foot span of the flight deck high into the air, and rolled back another swath of flight deck like the top of a sardine can. The ship began listing to port. After the fifth explosion, Tex Waldrop, the torpedo-busting torpedo bomber, General Motors pilot, lit a cigar, wrapped his hands in rags to insulate them against friction, and rode a line down into the sea. In the water, he broke his cigar in two and gave half to another survivor. Then the 2 men watched their home tear itself to pieces. The 6th and 7th blasts followed in merciless sequence, ripping the ship apart, one 50-foot stretch of steel at a time. Some of them sailed as high as 1,000 feet into the air. John Gettus saw the 7th blast from the water, some 200 feet from the ship. As debris slapped the surface all around him, he stripped himself naked for buoyancy and backstroked away from the Inferno. Cool and collected, Captain McKenna directed the orderly abandonment from the forward part of the flight deck and the forecastle. Having seen to the evacuation of as many crew as possible, he left the ship after the 7th explosion. The skipper was the last man to ride a line down to the sea. The 8th blast was a heavy one. McKenna thought it might have been the main bomb stowage going up. It finished the St. Lo, tearing her so severely below the waterline that her port list abruptly reversed itself. The ship reeled back to starboard, rolled over completely, lifted her bow from the water and backed herself under. She stood that way for a moment, then seemed to accept her fate and went down fast. The St. Lo's final protest was the detonation of her boilers, a muffled thump that created a pressure wave that hit John Gettus and created the sensation of a broom handle being shoved up his rear. Heartsick, Tom Van Brunt watched from the air as his ruined ship disappeared. He knew pilots who had landed on the ship. Now they were very possibly dead. Gone, too, was the air operations crew he had trusted with his life. He didn't want to try his luck landing on another carrier. You never knew how good its landing signal officer would be. Van Brunt had seen landing signal officers on other carriers who had to take their cues from the bridge. He didn't need that now. He turned his damaged Avenger toward Dulag, 20 miles south of Tacloban, which by all accounts was a mess of mud and wrecked airplanes. He got there, landed, inspected his aircraft, and found, as he expected, that his left rudder cable had been severed completely. What he was less prepared to see was the condition of his elevator cable. Only 3 of its 16 strands were intact. One false pull on his stick would have snapped it, plummeting him and his 2 crewmen into the sea. He also found that his landing hook had been shot off, without which he would have careened across a carrier flight deck right into the forward barrier, nearly as recklessly as the kamikaze that had hit the St. Lo. Dulag had its own attractions. Van Brunt, along with Larry Budnick and 2 other pilots, spent that night with the army. The weary pilots were given carbines, told to dig a foxhole, and instructed to watch out for the Japanese counterattack that was expected at any moment. They slept soundly in spite of everything, and the assault never came. When a ship sinks, the battlefield goes away, currents move, thermal layers mix, and by the time the surveyors and rescuers arrive, the water that bore witness to the slaughter is nowhere to be found. The dead disappear, carried under with their ruined vehicles. No wreckage remains for tacticians to study. There are no corpses for stretcher-bearers to spirit away, no remains to shovel, bag and bury. On the sea there is no place to anchor a memorial flagpole or a headstone. It is a vanishing graveyard. The sudden silence was the first thing many survivors of the Howell, the Gambia Bay, the Samuel B. Roberts, and the Johnston noticed after their ships had been smashed and swallowed. To many the quiet was unwelcome, the noise of battle, the roar of machinery, the shrieks and blasts of shells incoming and outbound, the shouts and screams of their buddies had anesthetized fear. Now the noise lifted like a curtain, unveiling the hidden inner vistas of their grief and shock. When their ships sank, their duties went down with them. Permanently discharged, the survivors were left without the distraction of work to do. The things they had seen could now be contemplated. The wounds they had suffered began to ache, sting, and burn. The 4 groups of men were scattered over roughly 30 miles of ocean. Survivors of the Howell, sunk first at 8:55 a.m., constituted the northernmost group. The Japanese had been in the heat of pursuit when the destroyer went down. The men of the Howell were then treated to a full fleet review as the Centre Forces Leviathans paraded past them to the south. After that, the survivors had no idea what had become of the enemy, or of the rest of Taffy 3 for that matter. South of where the Howell's men swam were the survivors of the Gambia Bay. They had the distinction of serving on the only American aircraft carrier in history ever sunk by enemy naval gunfire. Like the destroyer men, they had seen the enemy up close, had felt the heat of his muzzles firing. Finally, farther south still, floated the men from the Johnston and the Samuel B. Roberts, whose ships, having fought to the last, sank within a few minutes and a few thousand yards of each other. Such descriptions of the group's proximities, given with the benefit of a backward-looking bird's eye, were unavailable to the men in that terrible moment. The currents and wind took hold of them, and from their initial entry into the water, there was no telling how they moved relative to one another. 1,000 men dotted the ocean's swells, cast about by the waters. For small groups and individuals alike, however, the experience of survival was one of sudden sinking aloneness. The lazy swells of the Philippine Sea raised and lowered the men at regular intervals. At the top of a swell, if he was inclined, a man could take in his wide surroundings and look for other survivors to merge his fortunes with. In the bottoms, surrounded by gentle slopes of seawater like the sides of a shallow bowl, he would be left to contemplate his private misery. Land was but an abstraction, though the peaks of Samar were visible where the squalls and clouds permitted. Reaching up from beneath the horizon, the beaches that lay beneath them were out of sight, some 30 miles away. For a wounded, exhausted swimmer, it might as well have been a whole ocean. For them, the world existed only in 2 dimensions. With their eyes at sea level, they had no vertical parallax by which to gauge distance, and the physical fact of the round earth made height a telling advantage at sea. Lookouts on the ships with the tallest masts could see farthest and spot the enemy soonest. The Yamato was the first Japanese ship to fire, not only because of her powerful guns, but because her lookouts enjoyed the loftiest eyrie in the flotilla. When the survivors entered the water, however, the circumference of their world shrank like a contracted camera aperture. Even on the clearest day, the Howell's survivors would have been out of sight of the Roberts' survivors. Any imaginary line connecting them would have arced over the face of the earth far enough that the curve of the world blocked their view. By sweeping his arms together, George Bray gathered up a foamy pile of fuel oil and tried to splash it all away from him. But the stuff seemed to have a mind of its own. It floated back at him, sticking to everything. It would not go away. Here and there the slick was burning in the lazy manner in which oil is prone to burn. Bud Comet paddled his raft to Bray's group and tied up fast to the small flotilla of survivors. This group was 60-odd strong, gathered on and around a life raft whose wooden lattice bottom, suspended by ropes from the raft's hard foam ring, had been mostly shot out. Some 7 feet long and 4 or 5 feet wide, the raft was more like an oversized donut float than a proper inflatable boat. Tied up to the raft to form a little archipelago was a floater net, a 20 by 20 foot expanse of mesh netting made buoyant by hard rubber discs linked together in strings of 8. Jack Moore, Lieutenant Luther West, and Chief Cullen Wallace were its ranking members. Most of the men in this group were in fair health. About half of them had no injuries at all. The majority of the rest had wounds that were not immediately life-threatening, holes through flesh, gashes to limbs, odd burns and scrapes, blood leaking from the ears. A few were far worse off, and these men, en route to what would probably be a slow death, were laid inside the ring of the raft. Jerry Osborne, a water tender in the Roberts's demolished forward boiler room, had been scalded so severely that he had third-degree burns all over his body. He lapsed in and out of consciousness. The mid-ocean silence was now and then cut through with his and others' long groans, at unpredictable intervals swelling into screams. A few hundred yards away from them, on their own raft and floater net assemblage, drifted another group of about 50 men, among them Bob Copeland, Bob Roberts, Bill Burton, Dudley Moylan, Tom Stevenson, Lloyd Gurnett, and 2 of the ship's 4 surviving chiefs, Rudy Scow and Frank Cantrill. Some distance away on the current, another group of about 17 or so Roberts survivors clung to a far less sturdy contraption, a pair of 14-foot-long wooden planks that the deck division had once used as a scaffolding for scraping and painting the side of the hull. The structure wasn't seaworthy, and a lot of the men clinging to it were in very bad shape. It was clear to Stevenson and others that the wounded would be better off with them. Only 7 could fit inside the raft, so the captain and pharmacist's mate, Oscar King, evaluated their wounded and decided who would gain tenancy to this prime real estate. Everyone else floated in the water around the raft, clutching the manila lines of the floater net tied up to it. Tom Stevenson, Lloyd Gurnett, Soundman Third Class Lewis Gould, and Charles Natter, who was a particularly strong swimmer, spent a few hours on the afternoon of the 25th trying to unite the stragglers on the scaffolding with their group. They swam to it and struggled to move the bulky structure toward their own raft and net. When they tired of the impossible task of propelling the sagging mass of wood through the water, they tried to cajole the healthier survivors to swim with them. To their frustration, most of them refused to leave the scaffolding, a bird in the hand and all that. Staying put beat swimming an Olympic distance through waters well populated by large sharks. Ultimately, they settled for ferrying back to the raft men who were too weak to make it themselves and too shell-shocked to resist rescue. Yelling deliriously, Bill Stovall, Gun 52's pointer, was among several men pulled into Copeland's raft. He had been blown from the Mount's steel enclosure, his lungs scorched in the fiery blowback from the breach. He had lived long enough to see the ship sink, but as he hollered on, it was clear that the only humane thing to do was to avoid prolonging his agony. Exchanging pained, knowing glances and solemn nods, the men eased Stovall into the water and allowed it to swallow him. When the Roberts survivors got their first glimpse of the dim grey triangles cutting the water's surface around them, the stinking oil that fouled their hair, faces and eyes began to seem more a blessing than a curse. The high-grade American fuel, distinctive by smell from Japan's cruder Malaysian distillate, coated them completely, masking their identities from one another. Though their eyes stung from it, and they couldn't see much, the oil proved to be an effective shark repellent. The men noticed the way it seemed to keep the tall fins at a distance. George Bray scooped up a handful of black foam and smeared it all over his shoeless left foot. The last thing a guy needed was a shark mistaking a white sock for an appetizer. The oil was an efficient sunscreen, too. Most of the squalls had been warmed away by the rising South Pacific sun. It baked their skin and reflected off the sea to burn their undersides as well. But the oil protected their skin. Exposure to the ocean's elements didn't seem like much of a threat at the time. they knew help was on the way. Looking up, Tom Stevenson could see a swarm of specks against the ceiling of the blue sky, planes outbound on strike missions of some kind. The aircraft, could they be from the Taffys, were probably too high for their pilots to spot the survivors. Optimism reigned nonetheless. Figuring on a prompt rescue, Copeland had doled out most of the raft's provisions. Each man got 2 malted milk tablets, a piece of spam, and a few ounces of water. Sure enough, a good omen soon came. Around 3 p.m., out of the blue, came the low-throated growl of a right radial engine, drowning out the sound of seawater lapping against the raft. A torpedo bomber, General Motors Avenger, roared by, low over the wave-tops. The pilot banked hard, circling the group and flashing a thumbs-up sign through the long greenhouse canopy. As the plane zoomed away, its engine fading with the down Doppler, everyone was jubilant. That was it, Stevenson thought. They were all but rescued. The pilot would call in their position, and a ship or a submarine would be sent to get them. Swimming in the bloodied waters that had swallowed their ships, none of the survivors of the late great screening vessels of Taffy 3 were in a position to distinguish victory from defeat. The Japanese men of war that had sunk them had charged blithely past, presumably to sweep away the remains of Taffy 3 and to charge through Taffys 2 and 1 on the way into Leyte Gulf itself. Who was going to tell them what had really happened, and would they even have believed it? The men of the destroyers and destroyer escorts had helped win a victory of the most impossibly resounding kind. Their dashing skippers had put themselves on the line first and started an improbable rout. Now Bill Brooks and friends, the avenging angels from the escort carrier squadrons, would help finish it. Launching from the Marcus Island at 11:15 a.m., Brooks, the first Taffy 3 pilot to spot the Japanese fleet on its way south, was now among the last to watch it flee. He was in the vanguard of the Taffy's latest parting gift to the Japanese center force, a 56-plane strike whose savagery and efficiency tended to support Kurita's decision to withdraw. Pilots from the 16 escort carriers of the 3 Taffys formed pickup squads on the wing. Brooks flew with Ensign William McCormick of the Fanshawe Bay's VC-68 and Lieutenant Commander T.O. Murray, skipper of the Marcus Islands Resident Squadron VC-21. That group of 14 Avengers and 8 Wildcats merged with a group led by the Kadashan Bay's skipper, Lieutenant Commander John Dale, which in turn joined planes led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Fowler, the resourceful Kitkan Bay Air Group commander, who had taken a breather aboard the Taffy 2 Jeep Manila Bay after his morning exploits. They required no navigation data to find their targets. Raging fires from the stricken Chokai and the Chikuma produced twin columns of smoke that were visible from the flight deck of Taffy 2's carriers. This gathering of planes, which rendezvoused as green-dyed shell splashes from the Haruna, were walking the seas around Taffy 2's destroyer screen, was the 4th of 6 airstrikes that Taffy 2 would send against Kurita that day. They found the Japanese fleet about 15 miles east of Samar Island off Cebu Bay. The escort carrier pilots learned on the wing to do what Halsey's and Mitch's aviators prided themselves on doing. In the days leading up to the battle off Samar, several Jeep carrier fighter pilots had distinguished themselves in air-to-air combat against bombers swarming the Leyte invasion beachhead. Overall on the day, Wildcat pilots from the 3 Taffy groups downed 54 Japanese planes and claimed 20 more as probable. Now, with an enemy fleet within their grasp, it was the Avenger pilots' turn to work in the big leagues. Even had the Center Force commander not recalled his ships on the brink of triumph, they still would have had to survive this angry swarm of American planes. Indeed, with such a surprising gathering of strength arrayed against him, it remains unclear what Kurita could have accomplished had he pressed south toward Leyte Gulf. First, he would have done so alone. He had learned while withdrawing that Nishimura's southern force had been wiped out the night before, and he strongly and correctly suspected that MacArthur's transports had long since unloaded the last of their troops, weapons, food and supplies. The heavy cruisers Tone and Haguro, having gotten within 5.5 miles a short 10,000 yards of Sprague when Kurita's order went out, might have sunk a few more escort carriers, but they wouldn't have gotten far against aerial opposition such as this. 56 well-armed planes, and another strike arming on the Taffy 2 carriers behind them. Admiral Stump had ordered his planes to cripple as many Japanese ships as possible. There was no sense administering overkill with Halsey coming back south to clean up any messes they made. The American aviators made as many of them as they could. Kurita had more than he could handle keeping his fleet together in the face of the Blue Hornets from the escort carriers. Overtaking the withdrawing ships swiftly, the pilots circled at 8,000 feet, the radio frequencies ababble with pilots excitedly reporting their contacts. If radio communication was strained, the pilots now enjoyed the relative luxury of unpressured time in which to choose their targets. As Commander Dale's section took the starboard side of the formation and Fowler's the port, Bill Brooks, Ensign McCormick and Commander Murray passed the Japanese squadron and made a wide looping turn. When the signal went out to strike, they came in from the north, starting 8 miles out and bearing down on the enemy. According to Commander Murray's after-action report, in a beautifully coordinated attack, strafers led glide bombers followed by torpedo planes, which made their drops as the last bombs hit. The Japanese ships turned hard to port as the Americans swooped in. Murray pushed over into a steep right turn, following the ships, with McCormick behind him and Brooks bringing up the rear. When flak began to pepper the sky, the planes split formation, with Brooks and McCormick swinging to Murray's right, lining up a Nagato-class battleship, while McCormick lined up an Otogo-class heavy cruiser straight ahead. The Chokai was the only Otago-class heavy cruiser in this battle. "Now you're on your own," Murray said. But when McCormick opened his weapons bay doors, his torpedo fell out and plummeted to the sea. With the battleship in view, Brooks flew down to 900 feet, lining up 15 degrees off the ship's starboard bow and entering the critical needleball and airspeed phase of his run. If he had figured right, he would glide down to 500 feet and drop, and the battleship's counterclockwise turn, extrapolated to that point, would put it broadside to his torpedo in the last seconds of its bubbling approach. Ray Travers, hunched over his radar console's A-scope, hollered out the range to the target, first in miles, then in yards as the range closed. Joe Downs was itching for something to shoot at. He looked to starboard, and there lay a big Japanese cruiser. "I'm going to take on this cruiser, okay? It won't spoil your air flight, will it?" Downs asked Brooks over the intercom. Cranking the flat-sided spherical greenhouse glass turret out to the side changed the plane's aerodynamics, which was not always helpful to a pilot concentrating on making a delicate torpedo run. The pilot told him not to worry about it, so Downs went hunting. The gunner cut loose, sending a hot spray of tracers, ball and armor-piercing rounds, popping and ricocheting across the ship's superstructure. Joe Downs had nearly exhausted his ammo can when, abruptly, the plane lifted straight up with a jerk. He thought the plane had been hit. In the excitement, he had all but forgotten the 2,000-pound torpedo payload that Brooks had just released, creating quite a change in inertia. An endless series of seconds passed, 20 or 30 of them, while the torpedo cruised the 1,000-yard path to the ship. Seated rearward in the gunner's seat, Downs watched the ship shrink in the distance, then get swallowed in a flash of flame. Their torpedo struck forward of the bridge, producing a dirty geyser of water. The Nagato's bulky mass heaved and shuddered, seeming to lift slightly, then drop back into the sea. "Oh man, you got her! You got her!" Downs shouted. McCormick saw it too. Brooks circled to watch, then settled on a course that would take him back toward his adoptive home, the Taffy 3 flagship, the Fanshawe Bay. He was by no means unique in this regard, but it would be the third flight deck Brooks's wheels touched during that long day. At 12:40 a.m., about 20 minutes after Murray's and Brooks's attack, the Kitcon Bay's Richard Fowler led his group around a big cumulus cloud and dove down out of the sun. The loose enemy formation was looping around to the left, exposing its starboard flanks to Fowler's vengeful Blue Angels. The skipper dropped his bombs over a battleship, hitting it just aft of the bridge. His wingman's bombs struck near the mainmast, while 2 more pilots scored near misses astern. Another Avenger pilot reported hitting the Nagato with a torpedo amidships. A heavy cruiser just inboard of the battleship was struck by 2 bombs. Just before touching down on the Fanshawe Bay, Fowler picked up a transmission from the Wasp Air Group, one of Halsey's squadrons, reporting the sighting of the retiring enemy fleet. Ziggy Sprague's old ship, with the rest of Admiral John S. McCain's Task Group 38.2, was closing fast. The Third Fleet's contribution to the Battle off Samar was far too little, far too late. Because McCain's strike was launched at extended range, the pilots' fuel reserves were too low to permit deliberate target selection and preparatory manoeuvre. But their arrival did tend to underscore the point that had Kurita not withdrawn, he would have run smack into yet another powerful air group. At about 2:15 p.m., the Chikuma, crippled earlier by White Plains flyers, her topside charred by salvos from the Samuel B. Roberts, was finished off by planes from the Taffy 2 Jeep, Omani Bay. Preceded by 4 Wildcat fighters that spat 2,000 .50 caliber slugs into the cruiser, 3 torpedo bomber, General Motors Avengers, led by the VC-75 commander, Lieutenant Alan W. Smith, swooped in low and lay a spread of torpedoes into her port side, just forward of amidships. Seawater rushed in, and the cruiser heeled and rocked a few times, then rolled onto its port side and sank in about 15 minutes. Farther to the north, Taffy 3 pilots were in hot pursuit of any other Japanese ships that could still make steam. Tommy Lupo of the Fanshawe Bay's VC-68, having reholstered his pistol and reloaded with bombs commandeered from the army, had taken off from the airfield at Tacloban some time before. Heading north, he found a Mogami-class cruiser, probably the stubborn Kumano, limping towards San Bernardino Strait, her bow broken in the battle's early minutes. Gliding down alone, Lupo overtook the cruiser, dove on her from her starboard quarter, rode the bright rails of the ship's tracer bullets down to his bomb release point, and walked a brace of bombs right up her back. One of his 250-pounders appeared to drop right down the ship's exhaust stack. A fountain of smoke and crud shot skyward from amidships, and as he flew away, orange tongues of flame could be seen licking through the smoke. Intermingling orphaned pilots from Ziggy Sprague's task unit with the squadrons of his own 6 carriers, Taffy 2 Commander Admiral Stump's carriers mustered a total of 204 sorties against Kurita, 117 by Avengers and 87 by Wildcats, dropping 49 torpedoes and 286 5,000-pound bombs, and firing 276 rockets and untold thousands of rounds of machine gun ammunition. By the time the last of his pilots returned to Taffy 2 at 6:25 p.m., just before nightfall made carrier operations doubly hazardous, Kurita's force had been smashed down to size. Limping north towards San Bernardino Strait went a battered and broken center force, reportedly consisting of 4 battleships, just 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers. 2 of the battleships trailed broad slicks of oil, 3 destroyers and 1 of the light cruisers lagged behind the main group, and 1 heavy cruiser appeared heavily damaged. Impossible to catalogue, but probably significant nonetheless, were the assorted lesser catastrophes inflicted by the ceaseless strafing, bombing and battering by American 5-inch shells. 24 aircraft from the Jeep carriers had fallen to Japanese anti-aircraft fire, with 43 pilots and aircrewmen lost or missing in action. Some pilots survived by the slimmest of margins. Richard Roby, the Gambia Bay Wildcat pilot, escorted Foster Dillard back to Tacloban after a strike on the Japanese fleet. Seeing Dillard's plane swerving on an unsteady course, its pilot without a helmet and no hatch, bareheaded to the rushing wind, Robbie suspected immediately that his VC-10 squadron mate was punchier than a $3 bill. He couldn't keep a level heading, and if the young pilot could scarcely manage level flight, how would he handle a landing on a muddy, pitted airstrip? Somehow Dillard reached Tacloban, made a reasonably steady approach, and eased his Wildcat onto the muddy runway. The plane taxied down the tarmac, hit a soft spot, and flipped forward, driving its propeller hub into the ground. Robbie pulled around for another pass, giving the men on the ground time to push the wrecked fighter plane out of the way. Then Robbie made another approach and landed. When he found Dillard, the wounded pilot had taken so much shrapnel to the face that he looked like a smallpox patient. For the pilots of VC-10, as for all the pilots of Taffy 3, the morning of October 25 had been a long one. The aviators from the 7th Fleet's escort carriers finished the battle off Samar on their terms, because Kurita had declined to finish it on his. On whose terms the survivors in the water would end their ongoing struggle remained very much an open question. The impossible horror of the war's first kamikaze sinking had come upon them suddenly and without warning. Murderously effective, the attack on the St. Lo and the other escort carriers set the lookouts on Taffy 3's remaining ships on high alert. Though Ziggy Sprague worried about the possibility of submarine attack, there had been enough odd sightings of torpedo wakes coming at his ships during the morning's fighting to alert him to the threat. He detached what remained of his screen, the Heermann, the Dennis, the Raymond, and the John C. Butler, from escort duty, and ordered them to recover the survivors of the St. Lo dotting the sea where the carrier had gone down. Expertly conned by her skipper, Sig Hansen, her narrow hull draped in cargo nets for survivors to climb, the Dennis moved through the St. Lo's debris field retrieving survivors. The healthiest among them clambered aboard asking, "Hey, what's for chow? What's the movie tonight? Or where the hell is Haul-ass Halsey?" The worse off were pulled from the sea and given morphine and a soft place to lie down. The Dennis's rescue effort, led by First Lieutenant Frank Tyrrell and Chief Boatswain's mate Joe Barry, saved more than 400 survivors from the St. Lo, and 35 pilots. Retrieving the other survivors would be a much taller order. The Avenger pilot who sighted Tom Stevenson and the rest of the Roberts survivors, under strict radio silence, made a mental note of their coordinates to pass along to the 7th Fleet after he landed. It seems his mission lasted longer than his memory. The coordinates that were given to Admiral Kincaid were off by a wide margin. An attempted correction offered little more help. Admiral Stump informed the 7th Fleet commander around 12:30 p.m. that hundreds of survivors were adrift at 11 degrees 12 minutes north, 126 degrees 30 minutes east, which was 20 to 40 miles south of the various sites where the Taffy 3 ships had gone down. Though Ziggy Sprague was prompt in asking Admiral Kincaid to launch a rescue operation to save the survivors of Taffy 3, owing to the desperate nature of the fight against the continuing kamikaze attacks and the preoccupation of the PBY Catalina patrol planes with rescuing downed flyers, it wasn't until 3:30 p.m. that a serious rescue attempt was made. At that time, Admiral Kincaid ordered Tommy Sprague to detach all available screening ships and begin a search close to the original erroneous position. Because it consisted of ships unassisted by planes, the rescue mission had a margin for error much slimmer than the error itself. The destroyer escorts Eversole and Richard S. Bull steamed northeast and arrived at the specified coordinates at 11:30 p.m. Finding nothing, they returned to Taffy 1 empty-handed that night. When Admiral Halsey finally returned from chasing Admiral Ozawa's goose, he detached several destroyers to sweep the area, looking for Japanese stragglers. Though they passed close to where some Taffy 3 survivors floated, they were looking for things considerably larger than heads bobbing on the waves. They failed to locate them as well. As the afternoon wore on, Tom Stevenson, Charles Natter, and Lloyd Gurnett had just about given up their attempts to bring back the men floating on the planks. The survivors who clung to them, many badly hurt, were exhibiting a dangerous combination of recalcitrance and resignation. They refused to leave. The scaffolding must have been just seaworthy enough to make the reward of setting out for another precarious refuge seem dubious and theoretical, even if their captain was supposedly in charge there. Natter did his best to help them. He was a capable swimmer, athletic and strong. Adrenaline made up what strength he had lost from the shrapnel peppered through his shoulders, but there were limits to what the stout signalman could do. Men were not made to outswim sharks. The predators were gathering in growing numbers. For a time, the pool of fuel oil that surrounded them seemed to keep the sharks at bay, but by late afternoon enough blood had leached into the water to attract a crowd. Charles Natter was catching a breather on the scaffolding when the sharks ended the tease and acted on their nature. One of them came up and pulled Thomas Missoura, one of his friends from the Sammy B's signal division, from his plank. Natter had little time to mourn. Like an inverted fang, another big fin glided toward him, and he was hauled under too. Seeing it all happen, John Conway was at last persuaded to take his chances swimming for Copeland's raft. The coxswain tried to talk others into joining him, but hurt and exhausted, they wanted no part of it. Conway was the only man from the scaffolding to reach Bob Copeland's raft and floater net that afternoon. At one point, Copeland counted as many as 50 shark fins cutting the surface near him. Thanks to the oil that bathed the survivors in his group, These predators were all swimming and not biting. But because no one could be too confident of that, the men feared the worst whenever a fin moved closer and then disappeared under water. The captain of the Roberts didn't want to think about what might have happened to his signalman and the men he had gallantly tried to save. Whether through exhaustion, wounds, or willpower, the men stayed quiet. Their stoicism impressed Bob Copeland. I've read a lot of stories about how men on life rafts behave. They either curse their luck and curse everybody, or they get a big shot of religion and pray and sing songs. Our men didn't do that at all. They were a very quiet group. They bore their suffering in almost total silence. We were just beaten to a pulp, that's all. The only outbursts on Copeland's raft were the final thrashes of the dying. Charles Stoback, the grievously wounded chief electrician's mate, lay motionless inside the raft, tended to by healthy survivors. But around 3 that afternoon he went out of his head, ranting and raving deliriously before succumbing to death. As the sun fell in the western sky, optimism about a quick rescue was turning to discouragement. Copeland noticed that Bob Roberts's stoutly girded calm was giving way to a very evident despair. "I tried to bargain with God," Roberts later wrote. "I explained to him that my wife had just had a baby boy whom I had never seen, and that though I was ready and willing to die, if he would allow it, I would take care of them as long as I lived." Copeland huddled privately with his exec until Roberts regained his composure. "He was a tower of strength from there on in," Copeland wrote. Copeland asked Roberts, "Where do you think we are?" Roberts said, "Well, Captain, I don't know exactly where we are, but I'd say we're roughly 30 miles east of the island of Samar and about 30 miles north of its southern tip. That's as close as I can give you from the last navigational fix I had before we went into battle. That's close. We are within 5 miles, one way or another." 30 miles off Samar, if they were high enough above the water, in the crow's nest of a battleship using binoculars, they might have seen its shores. But from sea level, where they floated, the line of sight to the horizon was just 14 miles. When the clouds and rain permitted, all they could see were its peaks. "Well," Copeland said to Roberts, "you and I are the senior officers, and we better set a good example." They each took a paddle and climbed up on the side of the raft and began stroking a course west into the setting sun. The survivors from the Johnston were greater in number than the Roberts group, but were situated similarly to the other survivors from Taffy 3's sunken ships. Well over 100 men drifted the ravaged waters on lengths of plank and timber, on floater nets and life rafts, or were held afloat only by kapok vests or life preservers. Organised and calmed by their officers and senior petty officers, they decided to let their large group disperse on the currents, each group centred on a life raft/floater net ensemble, in order to maximise their chances of detection. The most seriously wounded were gathered inside the rafts. Howard Craven, from the electrical department, had his throat slashed clear around the neck by a large shard of shrapnel. Though few expected him to survive, he surprised them all not only by surviving, but by summoning the energy and Samaritan will to tend to James Cooper and Jack Walker, who had been badly burned and lay shivering in the raft. A large group that included Bob Hagan, Ellsworth Welch, Ed DeGardi, Jack Bechdel, Jesse Cochran, Milt Pale and Hank Wilson was clustered around 2 rafts and a pair of floater nets strung together with manila line. Wilson had gotten badly burned by boiler steam when the fire room was hit. Pharmacist's mate Clayton Schmuff swam about making his rounds, putting sulphur powder on burns and giving morphine to the most seriously wounded. Jack Bechdel, missing most of a leg, was so benumbed by morphine that he found it within himself to sing. With a voice mellifluous and strong, he sang as if they were gathered around a campfire. As the afternoon dragged on, Ellsworth Welch reflected on the ordeal that they had all just experienced, thinking their circumstances could only get better. "Our thoughts were 3,000 ships, 200,000 men, thousands of airplanes. It won't be long now. We were just a couple of 100 miles from the greatest naval armada ever assembled on Earth." To a man they were convinced that the proximity of powerful friendly fleets all but ensured their rescue. Their admiral knew they were out there. Pilots had sighted them. Rescue would be the simple product of time, patience, and fortitude. While they waited for America's overwhelming military power to come to their assistance, they passed the time struggling to keep their spirits up, wondering aloud about the outcome of the battle and the fates of particular shipmates, telling stories, passing cigarettes, and munching on hardtack biscuits and salty water. By mid-afternoon, their submerged doubts began to surface, along with the first sharks. Bill Mercer watched a particularly large one work its way toward them in a widely meandering zigzag, finally cruising by close enough that the men could extend their legs and kick at it. Faced with splashing and kicking life forms, it elected not to harm them. The men scanned the horizon through 360 degrees, watching their hopes for a speedy rescue diminish and vanish. When darkness fell, the sharks grew more assertive. In the pitch-black Pacific night, they revealed themselves by proxy. Moving through the plankton-rich waters, disturbing the photosensitive plant life, the sharks ignited an eerie phosphorescence that formed a faint glowing path toward the men in the rafts. There was splashing and cursing, shrill voices rose and then were gone. Someone said something about spotting a ship. Someone else produced a very pistol, and several flares lofted skyward, red, white, and green, burning arcs of colourful brilliance through the night. When there was no response in kind from the rescuer, the men feared they had alerted a Japanese ship. Their panic became quieter, if no less desperate. Drifting toward a fatal sleep, the men decided to fasten themselves together with their carbon dioxide inflatable lifebelts, assigned each other numbers, and counted off at intervals to indicate their physical and mental presence. Clint Carter had just finished securing himself to Chuck Campbell when someone yelled "shark," and the men started climbing atop one another toward the stars. In the zero-sum equation of saltwater buoyancy, one man's success was another man's sudden dunking. Something bumped Carter heavily in the back, and he felt a wrenching force. He screamed, put both hands on Campbell's shoulders, and lifted himself out of the water as a shark's bear-trap jaws tore away a chunk of his capoc, along with a small bloody piece of his side. As Carter rose up, his weight plunged Campbell under. The shark let go of Carter. Carter let go of Campbell, and Campbell surfaced, sputtering and gasping. Then the shark tasted Carter again, and once more he dunked Campbell in his bid for the raft, and the shark let go of Carter. Campbell surfaced, and regaining his breath, he helped lay Carter, bleeding badly, into the raft. Chief Gunner's mate, Harry Henson, got bitten in the thigh hard enough to crush bone. Joe Taramino took bites in the left arm and shoulder, Vince Scafolio in the area of his left kidney. In the night, despite the ministrations of their shipmate with the slashed throat, Cooper and Walker passed away. Someone offered a few solemn words. Their life jackets and lifebelts were removed for someone else's benefit. Their dog tags were collected, and their bodies were released and allowed to sink. Watching them go under, Bill Mercer felt like an 18-year-old boy going on 40. As the night deepened, hopelessness set in for the wounded, who could no longer endure the glacial passage of time. Before Ed Halbrich died of his severe leg wounds, he asked Dusty Rhodes, the cook in the chief's mess, for a sandwich. A Johnston sailor who had suffered a deep shark bite to the abdomen asked to be put out of his misery. For nearly an hour he begged for his shipmate's mercy, moaning, screaming, and crying. He finally received it when someone pulled out a revolver, misfired it, then produced a knife and cut his throat. "Why don't we all sing?" The survivors in Jack Moore's group made a half-hearted attempt to render a familiar tune. Old MacDonald had a farm, the Swanee River, deep in the heart of Texas. I've been working on the railroad, but they had suffered too much to indulge in musical reverie. Their hearts weren't in it. I remember a few people started singing, Dick Rhodes said, and then it just sort of died out. Nobody really wanted to sing. It didn't go over too well, though they stayed mostly quiet. The arrival of sharks triggered their survival instincts, and desperate spasms of fighting broke out, the men climbing one another like ladders, frantic to leave the water. They pushed one another down, clutching and grabbing with death-grip strength. They swallowed seawater, gagged and lunged upward, coughing and swinging fists. George Bray and Chalmer Goheen tried to quell the panic, but it had a life of its own. Finally, after the men had worn themselves out, it stopped by itself. When quiet settled in again, the men laid their heads on the sides of the raft, and on the coarse rope mesh of the floater net, George Bray struggled to remain alert. He was starting to think the sharks might be toying with them. He had seen them swimming in slow circles below. though it was hard to gauge precisely how large they were. He knew they weren't small. The last rays of daylight had revealed some big ones down there, 10, 12 feet long, he thought. There had been smaller fish present with them, hundreds of them hovering together in stationary schools, possibly barracuda. In months past, Bray and the others had occasionally seen sharks following the Roberts near dusk, gorging themselves as the garbage was thrown overboard. The sharks patrolling the waters off Samar on October 25, having endured the cacophony of the bloody morning, would find richer fare in the ensuing days. Eventually George Bray stopped worrying too much about what might be in the waters beneath him. By the time the sun was dipping out of sight to the west, fear of the big predators yielded to wary acceptance. Mostly he just stopped looking down. Mostly he started worrying about what might or might not be coming for them from over the horizon. When no ship came to rescue the survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts during the night, Tom Stevenson feared the Japanese had won the battle. The big force of Japanese cruisers and battleships, he thought, had incinerated the other ships of Taffy 3 and pressed on to the Leyte beachhead. What other conclusion could be drawn if any of the American ships had survived? Wouldn't they be combing the oceans where the Roberts and the others had gone down, pulling alongside and hauling them aboard to safety? The Sammy B's sacrifice, it seemed, had been in vain.